At 93, most folks are happy just keeping up with the grandkids or tending to a garden. But not him. He still wakes before sunrise, walks the same dusty path behind his ranch house, and checks on the horses like he's done for decades. There's a rhythm to his days, quiet, steady, and full of purpose. He doesn't chase attention. In fact, he's turned down more interviews than he's accepted over the last 10 years. So when his assistant mentioned a late-night talk show wanted him on, not to promote some flashy blockbuster, but to talk about a tiny film made by a first-time director, he almost said no. Again. But something about the project caught his ear. The young filmmaker had spent 3 years scraping together savings, shooting on weekends, and sleeping in his car just to finish the story. It was raw, honest, and reminded him of the early days in Hollywood, when movies were made with heart, not algorithms. That's what changed his mind. Not the spotlight, not the chance to be on TV, but the chance to shine a light on someone who reminded him of himself half a century ago. The show's producers were thrilled. Ratings had been slipping, and having a living legend, even a quiet one, was guaranteed to bring eyes to the screen. They sent a sleek black car, a stylist who was politely but firmly turned away, and a list of fun, lighthearted questions they hoped he'd answer. He skimmed it, handed it back with a small smile, and said, "I'll talk about the film. That's what matters." The night of the taping, the studio buzzed with energy. Cameras rolled, lights blazed, and the audience clapped wildly as he walked out, slow but sure, in a simple navy blazer and boots that had seen better decades. The host greeted him with exaggerated awe, joking, "We had to check 3 times that you weren't a hologram." The crowd laughed. He chuckled politely, took his seat, and settled in like he was visiting an old friend's porch. For the first few minutes, things went smoothly. He spoke warmly about the young director, how the kid had knocked on his office door with nothing but a worn-out script and a look in his eyes that said, "I've got to tell this story." He described the film's setting, a struggling fishing town, a father trying to reconnect with his daughter, and the quiet courage it takes to admit you've been wrong. No explosions, no superheroes, just people real and flawed. The audience leaned in. You could feel the room soften. Even the host seemed genuinely moved. But then, as the segment ticked past the 8-minute mark, the tone shifted. The host glanced at his cue cards, then back at the camera with that familiar smirk, the one that usually cues a viral clip. "So," he said, leaning forward with a grin, "you've been around since what? Black and white TV? Do you even remember which decade you're in anymore?" A beat of silence. Some nervous giggles. Most guests would laugh it off. But he didn't. He just looked at the host, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet disappointment, like a teacher watching a bright student waste their talent on cheap tricks. "I remember plenty," he said, voice calm but firm. "I remember when respect was part of the job, when you didn't have to punch down to get a laugh." The host blinked, clearly not expecting that. He tried to recover with another joke, something about rotary phones and needing a map instead of GPS. But this time, the laughter felt forced. A few people in the front row exchanged glances. The energy in the room had changed. Backstage, the young filmmaker watched from the monitor, stomach in knots. He'd begged not to be mentioned, not to make things awkward. But now he worried this whole appearance would backfire, that instead of helping his film, it would become a meme about old guys getting roasted. But the man on stage wasn't done. He took a slow breath, then leaned slightly toward the host. "You know," he said, "I could sit here and tell war stories all night. But that's not why I came. I came because there's a kid who poured his soul into something real. And if we only celebrate noise and forget the quiet voices, we lose something important." The studio fell almost silent. Even the crew stopped shuffling. The host, for once, had nothing ready. He fumbled for a transition, mumbled something about passion, and cut to commercial. Later, in the green room, no one knew what to say. The makeup artist hovered near the door. The producer gave a tight smile and thanked him for coming. But the young director just walked up, eyes a little wet, and shook his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not letting them turn this into a joke." He nodded. Stories matter. People matter. The rest is just noise. Back at the hotel that night, he didn't check his phone. He didn't care about the overnight ratings or whether the clip would trend. He ordered room service, a plain omelet, black coffee, and sat by the window looking out at the city lights. He thought about the early days when he'd sleep on couches and eat beans for a week just to stay in the game. He thought about all the times he'd been underestimated, too quiet, too slow, too old, and how every single time he'd let his work speak louder than words. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but sometimes just showing up, with honesty, with grace, was enough to shift the whole room. The next morning, his flight home was at dawn. As the car pulled away from the studio lot, he glanced back once. Not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. He'd done what he came to do. The rest was up to the world, and somewhere a young filmmaker was already editing a new scene, this time with a little more courage and a lot more hope. The clip hit the internet before the show even finished airing. Someone in the audience had recorded it on their phone, grainy, slightly off angle, but clear enough to catch every awkward pause and forced laugh. Within an hour, it was everywhere. Social feeds, group chats, late-night meme pages. The headline wrote itself, "Host Roast Legend Gets Shut Down IRL." But the truth was messier than that. Backstage, right after the commercial break, the mood was tense. The host paced near the coffee machine, scrolling through his phone with a tight jaw. His producer stood nearby, arms crossed, muttering about tone and audience perception. Meanwhile, the young filmmaker sat quietly in a corner, replaying the moment in his head. He kept thinking, did I cause this? Should I have stayed home? He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was a chance to tell his story, the one about the fisherman who loses everything but finds his way back through his daughter's eyes. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have car chases or punchlines, but it was true. And now, because of a few seconds of on-air teasing, it felt like the whole thing was being drowned out by noise. The host returned to the set for the second half of the interview, noticeably more subdued. He tried to steer things back to safer ground, asked about favorite movie moments, working with legends, what advice he'd give new creators. The answers were thoughtful, warm even. But the damage was done. The magic of those first few minutes, the real connection, was gone. The audience clapped politely, but you could feel the shift. People were waiting for the next zinger, or worse, bracing for another misstep. After the taping wrapped, the host approached him near the exit. "Hey," he said, voice lower now, no cameras around. "I didn't mean anything by it, just how the show runs, you know? Keep things light." He looked at the man, not with judgment, but with that same quiet steadiness he'd shown on stage. "Light doesn't have to mean careless," he said gently. "You've got a big platform. People listen when you talk. That's a gift. And gifts like that, they come with responsibility." The host nodded, but didn't say much else. Maybe he heard it, maybe he didn't. Either way, the handshake that followed felt more like an ending than a beginning. By the next morning, the online reaction had split into two camps. One side cheered him for standing his ground, calling it a masterclass in dignity. The other accused the host of ageism, demanding apologies and boycotts. Comment sections filled with heated debates. Was it really that bad? It was just a joke. Countered by, "Would you say that to your grandfather?" But the man himself stayed off social media. He never posted, never replied. He'd learned long ago that the internet amplifies everything, kindness and cruelty alike, and that feeding either side rarely changed minds. Instead, he called the young filmmaker. "How you holding up?" he asked. There was a pause, then a tired laugh. "Honestly, scared. I keep thinking this whole thing's gonna bury the film before anyone even sees it." "Nah," he said. "People are smarter than that. They'll see past the noise." He wasn't just being kind. He'd been through this before, back in the 70s when critics called his directing too slow, or in the 90s when they said he was past his prime. Each time he'd let the work speak, and eventually it did. Meanwhile, the talk show's team scrambled. Internal emails flew. Marketing tried to spin the segment as bold and unfiltered. But behind the scenes, the mood was uneasy. Ratings spiked that night. Curiosity always draws eyes. But the feedback wasn't the usual hilarious or iconic. It was mixed, confused, even disappointed. Longtime viewers wrote in saying they felt uncomfortable. Newer fans called it cringe. Even the network's standards department sent a quiet note. Let's revisit tone guidelines for guest interactions. The host, usually quick with a comeback on social media, stayed silent for 2 full days. No jokes, no deflections, just radio silence. That alone told its own story. Back in the editing suite, the young filmmaker watched the raw footage of the interview over and over. Not the viral clip, the full cut. And something surprised him. In the moments before the joke, there was real warmth. The host had leaned in when he talked about his dad teaching him to fix engines. He'd smiled when he described shooting sunrise scenes on the coast. For a few minutes, it felt like 2 people actually connecting. Then the script took over. The need to perform. The pressure to deliver a moment that would clip well. That's what hurt the most, not the mockery, but the wasted chance. A real conversation could have helped his film reach thousands. Instead, it became a sideshow. Still, he refused to give up. He posted a short video on his own channel. Not angry, not defensive. Just him, sitting in his tiny apartment, holding the script. This story isn't about me, he said. It's about second chances. About showing up even when you're scared. And if you're willing to look past the noise, I'd be honored if you watched it. He didn't mention the talk show, didn't name names, just shared his why. And something unexpected happened. People responded. Comments poured in. Your voice matters. Don't let them drown you out. I'm watching opening night. Then, late that week, a film critic known for championing indie work wrote a piece titled, "The Quiet Film Everyone Missed While Arguing Online." It praised the movie's honesty, its lack of pretense, and, most of all, its heart. In a world obsessed with volume, the review read, sometimes the softest voices carry the furthest. That same day, a major streaming platform reached out. They'd seen the buzz, not the controversy, but the genuine interest in the story itself. They wanted to distribute the film. Wide release. The young filmmaker called him, voice shaking. It's happening, he said. Because of you. No, he replied. Because of you. I just opened the door. You walked through it. But the ripple didn't stop there. Older viewers, people who'd grown up watching his films, started sharing their own stories online. A retired teacher wrote about how Unforgiven gave her courage to speak up at a school board meeting. A veteran posted a photo of his dog-eared copy of $1 Million Baby, saying it helped him talk about grief with his son. These weren't fan letters. They were human moments, sparked by characters and choices made decades ago. And slowly, the conversation shifted. Less about who said what on a talk show and more about why stories like these still matter. Why respect, on screen and off, isn't old-fashioned. It's essential. The host, watching all this unfold from his office, finally posted a short statement. No excuses, just, I missed the point that night. Real strength isn't in the punchline, it's in listening. I'm sorry. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes that's enough to start again. As for the man at the center of it all, he was back on his ranch fixing a fence, boots muddy, sun on his face. He'd heard the updates about the film's new release, the messages, the apology, but he didn't dwell on any of it. He'd said what he needed to say, done what he came to do. Now it was time to let the story live on its own. And maybe, just maybe, remind the world that silence, when it's full of meaning, can be louder than any joke. The morning after the apology post, something unusual happened. The talk show's usual flood of reaction videos, hot takes, outrage compilations, 10 reasons he was wrong, just stopped. Instead, people started sharing clips of old interviews, quiet moments from films, even behind-the-scenes footage of him patiently coaching a nervous first-time actor. No commentary, just the footage, and the silence around it spoke volumes. He didn't see any of it. He was in his workshop sanding the edge of a wooden chair he'd been repairing for weeks. His hands moved slowly but surely, each stroke deliberate. He'd always found peace in tasks that didn't demand applause, just attention, care, and time. The kind of time people said no one had anymore. But out in the world, the shift was real. A high school teacher in Ohio showed a scene from Gran Torino to her class. Not for the action, but for the moment when the main character sits on his porch, listening to his neighbors argue, and chooses kindness over pride. This, she told her students, is what courage looks like when no one's watching. In a small town in Oregon, a retired firefighter posted a photo of his dog-eared copy of $1 Million Baby, open to a page he'd underlined years ago. People die every day. It's how they live that matters. He wrote, "Lost my best friend last month. This line got me through." These weren't orchestrated campaigns. No hashtags, no influencers. Just ordinary people reaching for something real in a noisy world, and finding it in stories he'd helped bring to life. Meanwhile, the young filmmaker was in overdrive. With the streaming deal locked in, he was suddenly juggling color grading sessions, sound mixes, and last-minute poster tweaks. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt grounded. Every time doubt crept in, what if no one shows up? What if they only see the drama? He'd remember the quiet look the older man gave him backstage. That look said, "Keep going. This matters." He started hosting small preview screenings in community centers and indie theaters. No red carpets. Just folding chairs, popcorn from a local shop, and honest conversations afterward. At one screening in Detroit, an elderly man stayed behind after everyone left. He walked up slowly, eyes glistening. "My daughter and I, we haven't spoken in 3 years," he said. "But watching that scene on the dock where the dad finally says, 'I'm sorry,' I think I'm ready to call her." The filmmaker didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and handed the man a postcard with the film's release date. Sometimes that's all you can do. Back in California, the talk show host quietly invited a different kind of guest the following week, a poet in her 70s who just published her first collection. No jokes, no gotcha questions. Just a real conversation about memory loss and why she started writing at 68. The audience listened, really listened, and the ratings, they held steady. Maybe people were hungry for something that didn't feel like a performance. Then came the unexpected call. A major film festival, one known for spotlighting bold new voices, wanted to premiere the young filmmaker's movie as their opening night feature. Not because of the controversy, they made clear, but because the film itself stood on its own. "It's rare," the programmer said, "to see something this honest without trying to shout." He called the older man that night. "They want to open with it," he said, voice thick with disbelief. In front of critics, industry folks, everyone, there was a pause. Then a soft chuckle. "Good. Let them see what happens when you bet on heart instead of hype." The week before the premiere, the two of them met for coffee at a quiet diner off the highway. No cameras, no assistants, just two people who'd been through something strange together. They didn't talk about the talk show. They talked about light, how the golden hour on the coast makes everything look like it's glowing from the inside. They talked about mistakes, second chances, and the kind of stories that stick with you long after the credits roll. "You know," the older man said, stirring his coffee, "most folks think legacy is about awards or box office numbers, but it's not. It's about the moments you help someone else find their voice. That's the only thing that lasts." The younger man looked down at his cup, blinking fast. He'd spent so long trying to prove he belonged in this world. But in that moment he realized he already did. Not because of fame, but because he'd chosen to tell a story that mattered. The night before the festival, he couldn't sleep. He walked the streets of the city, past lit-up marquees and late-night food trucks, thinking about all the people who'd believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself. He thought about the quiet strength of the man who'd sat on that talk show stage and refused to play the game. And he made a promise, to himself, to the story, to everyone who'd shown up for him. "I won't waste this." The next evening, the theater filled slowly. Critics in neat blazers, students in hoodies, couples holding hands. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up. And for the next 90 minutes, no one checked their phone. No one whispered. They just watched, really watched, as a broken man tried to mend what he'd shattered, not with grand speeches, but with small, stubborn acts of love. When it ended, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the room erupted. Not polite applause, real roaring, tearful applause. People stood. Some hugged strangers. One woman wiped her eyes and said, "That was my dad." Backstage, the young filmmaker stood frozen, overwhelmed. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned. It was him. The older man wearing the same simple blazer from the talk show, but this time his eyes were bright with pride. "You did it," he said quietly. "No," the younger man replied. "We did." And in that moment, the noise of the past weeks, the jokes, the backlash, the headlines faded into the background. What remained was something far more powerful. 2 generations, connected not by fame but by faith in a story worth telling. Later that night, as the after-party buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses, the older man slipped out quietly. He didn't need the spotlight. He'd seen what he came to see, the next wave rising steady and sure. He got into his car, drove through the quiet streets, and headed home. The stars were out. The road was clear, and somewhere behind him a new voice had just been heard loud and clear. The morning after the premiere, the young filmmaker woke to a phone buzzing nonstop. Not with angry comments or confused DMs, but with messages that felt like handshakes, like quiet nods of respect. A veteran filmmaker he'd admired since film school wrote, "You reminded me why I started." A high school student in rural Kansas said the father-daughter scene made her call her own dad for the first time in months. Even a few critics who'd been skeptical posted thoughtful reviews, not just about the film's craft, but about its heart. It wasn't viral in the usual sense. No memes, no outreach cycles, just a slow, steady wave of people saying, "This mattered to me." And that, more than anything, felt like victory. Meanwhile, the talk show host sat in his office staring at a stack of viewer letters, real paper letters, the kind people don't write much anymore. One came from a woman in her 80s. "My husband served in Korea. He never talked about it. But after watching that old actor stand his ground with such quiet strength, my grandson asked him about it for the first time. Thank you for reminding us that dignity isn't outdated. It's rare and precious." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer, the one he used for things he didn't want to lose. He'd spent years chasing clips that exploded online, jokes that trended for a day, then vanished. But this lingered, and it made him wonder, what if real connection was more powerful than a quick laugh? What if the audience wasn't just looking to be entertained, but to be seen? A week later, he did something unusual. He invited the young filmmaker onto the show again. Not for damage control, but for a real conversation. No writer's room punchlines. No pre-planned moments. Just 2 people talking about storytelling, fear, and why some truths only come out in silence. This time, the host listened. Really listened. When the filmmaker described shooting the final scene on a foggy morning with borrowed equipment and a crew who hadn't slept in 2 days, the host didn't cut in with a quip. He just said, "That sounds like love." And it was. The audience responded differently too. No nervous laughter. No waiting for the next zinger. Just quiet attention. The kind that says, "I'm with you." Back home, the older man watched the rebroadcast over breakfast. He didn't say much, but his assistant noticed the small smile as he sipped his coffee. "He's learning," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The film's release date arrived not with billboards or flashy trailers, but with something quieter. Community screenings in libraries, veteran centers, even a few churches. People brought their parents. Teens brought their grandparents. After each showing, strangers stayed to talk about regrets, forgiveness, the things left unsaid. The movie became less of a product and more of a conversation starter. One rainy afternoon in Portland, a man sat alone in the back row of a small theater. He hadn't planned to come. He'd just been walking past when he saw the poster, a silhouette of a man and a girl on a dock at sunset. Something about it pulled him in. Halfway through the film, he started crying. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears he didn't bother to hide. Afterward, he walked up to the volunteer handing out postcards and said, "Tell the filmmaker, thank you. I'm going to call my daughter tonight." That night he did, and she answered on the first ring. As word spread, film schools began using the movie in their classes, not just for its technique, but for its restraint. "Notice how he doesn't explain everything," one professor told her students. "He trusts you to feel it." Students nodded, taking notes. But what they really took away was the courage to tell small stories with big honesty. Even Hollywood took notice, not with flashy offers or sequels, but with quiet respect. Producers started asking the young filmmaker, "What's next?" Not because they wanted to replicate the buzz, but because they sensed he understood something many had forgotten. That audiences crave authenticity more than spectacle. He didn't rush into anything. He went back to his apartment, sat at his kitchen table, and opened a fresh notebook. The blank page didn't scare him anymore. He knew now that stories worth telling don't need fireworks. They just need truth, and someone brave enough to speak it gently. Meanwhile, the older man returned to his ranch, back to his morning walks and his horses. Reporters still called, hoping for a quote about the comeback or the cultural moment. He always declined. "I didn't do anything special," he'd say if pressed. "I just showed up." But those who knew better understood. Showing up, with your full self, your values intact, your kindness unwavering, is one of the hardest things to do in a world that rewards noise. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he received a package. No return address, just his name in neat handwriting. Inside was a DVD of the film, a handwritten note from the young filmmaker, and a single photo. The two of them backstage after the premiere, caught mid-laugh, looking less like legend and newcomer, and more like friends. He pinned the photo to his workshop wall, right next to an old snapshot of his first crew from 50 years ago. Different faces, same spirit. The next day, a local high school asked if he'd speak to their film club. He almost said no, too much attention, too much fuss. But then he remembered the kid who'd knocked on his door with nothing but a script and a dream. So he said yes. He didn't give a speech. He just sat on a folding chair, answered questions, and told them, "Don't chase what's loud. Chase what's true. The rest will follow." Afterward, a shy student hung back. "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked, and said, "Every single day. But belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about standing for something. And if you do that long enough, the right people will find you." She smiled, and for the first time that day, so did he. Back in the city, the film crossed a quiet milestone, over 1 million views on its official streaming page. Not from algorithms or paid ads, but from people sharing it with someone they loved. "Watch this," they'd say. "It reminded me of us." And in living rooms, dorm rooms, and late-night kitchens across the country, people pressed play and found, not just a story, but a mirror. The noise had faded, but the echo remained. The premiere night arrived not with flashing lights or red carpets, but with something quieter, a steady rain falling over the old theater downtown. Umbrellas dotted the sidewalk as people walked in, shaking off water, laughing softly, holding tickets printed on plain paper. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and fresh popcorn. No velvet ropes. No security shouting into headsets. Just folks finding their seats, whispering to friends, glancing at the screen with something like hope. Backstage, the young filmmaker stood near the curtain, heart pounding. He'd been through screenings before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about his film anymore. It was about everything that had led here. The awkward interview, the quiet apology, the letters from strangers, the late-night calls from people who saw their own lives in his story. He took a deep breath and looked around. And there, leaning against the wall in a simple dark coat, was the man who'd started it all. He didn't say much, just gave a small nod, but that nod carried decades of trust, of knowing what it meant to stand alone in a room full of noise and choose kindness instead of cleverness. The younger man walked over. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said, voice low. The older man shook his head. "You were always here. I just reminded you to stay." Out in the audience, a woman sat with her father, 78 and stubborn as ever. They hadn't spoken much since her mom passed. But when she saw the poster for the film, a man and his daughter on a quiet dock at dawn, she bought 2 tickets and left them on his kitchen table. He showed up without a word. Now as the lights dimmed, he reached over and squeezed her hand. She didn't let go. On screen, the story unfolded slowly. No explosions, no villains in black hats. Just a man trying to fix what he broke, not with grand speeches, but with showing up, day after day, even when it hurt. The audience leaned in. Some wiped their eyes. Others sat perfectly still, like they were holding their breath. When the final scene faded to black, a simple shot of the 2 characters sitting on a porch, saying nothing, just being together, the silence lasted longer than anyone expected. Then slowly someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole room was on its feet. not because it was expected, but because they needed to say thank you somehow. Backstage, the young filmmaker stepped into the spotlight for the Q&A. His voice shook at first, but then steadied. Someone asked what inspired the film. He didn't talk about budgets or festivals. He said, "It came from watching people try to love each other even when they don't know how. That's the bravest thing I know." Then he paused, looked out into the crowd, and added, "And it's dedicated to a man who taught me that respect is the loudest statement you can make." All eyes turned toward the back row, where the older man sat quietly, head slightly bowed. The applause swelled, not loud or flashy, but deep, warm, full of gratitude. He stood, gave a small wave, and sat back down. No speech, no fanfare, just presence. After the event, people lingered in the lobby, not rushing to leave. Strangers talked to each other about their own fathers, their regrets, the things they wished they'd said. A teenager hugged his grandpa and whispered, "I get it now." An older couple held hands as they walked out into the rain, not saying a word but walking a little closer than before. The next morning, the filmmaker drove out to the ranch. He didn't call ahead, just showed up with 2 paper cups of coffee and a quiet heart. The older man was in the barn, brushing down a horse. He looked up, smiled, and said, "You look like you slept." "Not really," the younger man admitted. "But it was worth it." They sat on the fence rail, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the hills. No cameras, no audience, just 2 people who'd been through something strange and beautiful together. "You know," the older man said after a while, "most folks think legacy is about statues or headlines, but it's not. It's about the moments you help someone else find their footing. That's what lasts." The younger man nodded. He finally understood. This wasn't about fame or even about the film. It was about passing the torch, not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet act of faith. Back in the city, the film kept finding its way into people's lives. A therapist began showing clips in grief counseling sessions. A community center in New Orleans hosted a screening, followed by a letter-writing night. People writing to those they'd lost touch with. One man drove 6 hours just to attend, then mailed his letter the next day. His son called him that evening. Even the talk show changed. Not overnight, but steadily. The host started asking deeper questions. He gave guests room to breathe. Sometimes he just listened. Ratings didn't skyrocket, but the messages did. "Thank you for treating us like adults," one viewer wrote. "It feels like you finally see us." As for the older man, he returned to his routine. Early walks, fixing fences, checking on the horses. Reporters still called, but he never mentioned the premiere, the standing ovation, or the dedication. When asked what he was working on, he'd just say, "Living." But those who knew him saw the difference. He seemed lighter, not because of praise, but because he'd seen proof that the values he'd carried all these years, decency, patience, quiet courage, weren't outdated. They were needed more than ever. One afternoon, a package arrived at the young filmmaker's apartment. Inside was a worn copy of an old screenplay, the first one the older man ever directed. On the cover, in neat handwriting, for the next chapter, "Keep it real." He placed it on his shelf right beside his own script, not as a trophy but as a compass. Months later, at a small film festival in Montana, the younger man premiered his next short. It was even quieter than the last, just a woman tending her garden after losing her husband, finding peace in the rhythm of the seasons. After the screening, a woman in the front row stood up and said, "That was my life last year. Thank you for seeing me," he smiled. "I didn't do it alone." And somewhere far away, an old man watched the sunrise, sipped his coffee, and knew, without needing to hear it, that the work would go on. Not with noise, but with heart. Not with mockery, but with meaning. Because in the end, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that shout the loudest. They're the ones that whisper, "You're not alone," and make the whole room lean in to listen.